All right. All right, we good?
Baruch Hashem.
Okay. Shmuel, we got a packed house. No comment. Okay. Let us begin. We have begun the fifth chapter of Bav Metzia Ezehu Neshech. So I wanted to give a basic introduction, because Ezehu Neshech, a very, very difficult chapter that talks about the rules of interest. Now, by now we're like about a week through the chapter, so you should familiarize yourself. First of all, there are three separate areas in the Torah that discuss the prohibition of taking interest. The first is in Parshas Mishpatim, where the pasuk says, "Im kesef talve es ami es ha'ani imach lo siela kenosha." Right, when you right, this is the commandment of lending money. It says you shouldn't oppress the borrower, and then it says lo tesimun alav neshech. Okay, you're forbidden from taking neshech. Okay, from charging interest. That is the first source. The second source, and this second source from Parshas Bahar, is really the crux of where the Gemara discusses on Daf Samach Aleph, the topic of neshech and tarbis, because the Mishnah says ezehu neshech ve'ezehu tarbis, and the Gemara says, well, they're really the same thing, but the reason why we get those two names is from the pasuk in Bahar. The pasuk says, I'm reading from Bahar, Parek Chavhei, Psukim Lamed Vav and Lamed Zayin. Well, it actually starts pasuk Lamed Hey. It says V'chiyamuch achicha. Okay, Parshas Bahar, if you remember, talks about the laws of the Levium and the laws of tzedakah, different about redeeming, about batei are about estei achuza, and all the various agricultural laws. But it does talk about tzedakah. So the pasuk says that if your achicha, your brother, is in bad condition, umataya do imach, and you should, and he comes and he stretches out his hand, behechazak dabo, you should help him. Ger v'toshav v'chai imach, you should help him, support him with loans. But pasuk Lamed Vav says, Al tikach me'eto neshach v'tarbis v'yaresa me'elokecha. Okay, you can't take neshach and tarbis. V'yaresa me'elokecha, v'yaresa me'elokecha v'chai achicha imach. That's the second pasuk. There's a third pasuk, says not only neshach but tarbis, says kaspacha lo titen lo b'neshach u'b'marbis lo titen achlecha. The last pasuk recaps it, and this is what the Gemara uses as a source. It says, as kaspacha lo titen lo b'neshach u'b'marbis lo titen achlecha. So that's the second area in the Torah where it warns against interest. And the last is in Parshas Kiteitzei. In Parshas Kiteitzei, chapter 23. Let me open it up. Where it again, Kiteitzei is a repeat. It says lo tashich la'achicha neshach kesef neshach ochel neshach kol davar asher yishach. Lenachri tashich, pasuk 21 in chapter 23 says, you can't take it from a Jew, but you could take it from a non-Jew. Okay, so there's three separate sources, and you could say to yourself, wow, the Torah must have been pretty serious about this prohibition, because sometimes, a lot of times it's mentioned once, regarding prohibitions. And then in Dvarim, usually Kitetze, it's repeated. But when it comes to interest, the Torah has a special dislike. Okay, and if you haven't picked that up over the first week or so, right, you'll never get it. But this is really to show that the Torah has a special dislike for interest. There's something about it, and we're going to see a little bit. There's something about it that the Torah felt that it had to repeat itself 3 different times. Okay? And the first time that it's actually talked about, that like we mentioned in Parshas Mishpatim, that is the first time that the Sefer HaChinuch picks it up in mitzvah number 68. Because there's something unique about this Aveira. What's unique, and I'm reading from the Sefer HaChinuch, this is mitzvah number 68, Shelo nashis yad ben lova lamalva beribas. Okay? It's not just you can't lend with interest. The pasuk says lo tesimun, plural. Okay? Lo tesimun comes to tell you that there's something going on over here. There's something special that the Torah had to call it in a lashon plural, right? In lashon rabim, and the chinuch says shelo nitasek b'milvat ribut ben halove v'hamalve. That it applies not only to the malve, which would be your first choice, it applies to the love. Rashi, the chinuch says klomar. Again, mitzvah 68. Shelo na'aseh lahem arvut v'lo na'ir aleihen v'lo nichtav b'neihem shtar sheyesh bo asharat ribit. Shenemar lo tisimo alav neshech. The Gemara later on Daf Ayin Hey is going to say that anybody involved, anybody in the room, right? We don't find this by any other prohibition. Anyone who had any say in the matter, whether it be the judge, whether it be the malve or the love or the arev, right? The arev is the guarantor. If he was involved, whether it be the sofer, right? The sofer who wrote up the document, anybody who partook, right? Who got an assist, right? In this sin is all included in the lo taseh of neshech. Okay? Says the chinuch.
Are they all able to get lashes?
So we're going to discuss that because there really aren't lashes, because this is a special kind of a mitzvah that is nitan lehishavon. It's a very big machlokes rishonim. The Ritva gets involved about whether this is a considered a lav she'ein bo maisa, or whether it's considered a lav hanitan lehishavon. So either way, in case you're worried, no one gets malchus for this. So that's off the bat. But still, there's a discussion about why exactly you don't get malchus, but pretty much it's the unanimous opinion that everyone says that there's no malchus for this. And if you look on later on, toward the end of the parak on Daf Ayin Hey, and the chinuch brings it down over here, Uklal ha'inyan she'amar abayasham shehamalva over al shisha lavim. Believe it or not, there's 6, and you could see from the psukim that we read, right? Each pasuk is double, so there's 6 separate lavim that the malva gets. Okay, and the lova gets 2. Okay, and the other people who are involved in the party get only 1. So the chinuch in the next paragraph in 68 gives you the reason for the prohibition of the of neshech, of charging with interest. Says the chinuch, ki ha'el hatov chafetz biyishuv amo asher bacha. Right, the chinuch, as we know, we pretty much do a sefer chinuch almost every time we look at a mitzvah. Right, he's the go-to guy, and he usually starts off in the same theme: how God chose us, we're the desired people, and He likes our yishuv, our settlement. Right, He wants us to be in a good settlement that He chose for us. V'alken tziva lahasir michshol midarkam Laval yivla ha'echad chel chavera. So therefore, he commanded us to remove these mechsholim. A mechshol is literally a stumbling block from our path, which is what? That laval yivla ha'echad chel chavera. One should not swallow up. Literally, yivla means to swallow. A person shouldn't swallow up the strength or the wealth of his friend, because as we're going to see, the reason why it's called neshech, and Rashi points this out in several locations, is because it's like a snake bite. You don't feel it in the beginning, and anyone who's ever taken out a 29% APR credit card knows that over time, right, they feel like they keep on paying forever because that's how they get you. Right, you keep on paying and paying, and you may not pay a lot in the beginning, but in the end, oh boy, you'll see how much you're really paying. And that, in a nutshell, is the problem of ribis. Okay, that's the way Rashi describes it. That's how the Rishonim describe it, and the Gemara itself says it. And here the Chinuch says it pretty much word for word. Right? He says, you're going to be cleaned out of your house, okay, out of house and home. Ki ken darko shel ribis is the way interest right, and avoiding this by the array will also. So the Chinuch talks about it, and again, it's very important right off the bat that we don't find any other, as far as I can remember, any other. It's everybody who is assisting in the matter, right? So that's really, off the bat, something that sets risk aside from any other Aveira. But the Minchas Chinuch makes a comment right in the beginning, and he quotes the Tosfos in the beginning of the Masechta. He says, "Sham kasvu da'are v'sofer ve'edim im lo haya milva belohem ovrim gamken alav lifnei iver lo titen michshol." So here's an interesting situation, because, as we just said, there are so many people involved. You have to say to yourself, what are these people doing? We use the word assisting. Now, as soon as we use the word assisting, we should say, that sounds like lifnei iver, because what is lifnei iver about? The prohibition of lifnei iver is helping someone commit a sin. You get a separate, well, there's actually a discussion how we tally lifnei iver, if it's a lav by itself, or is it part of the actual sin? Maybe we'll see that one day. That's a hel hakira by itself. But at least for now, the sin that they get, what if, okay, the Minchas Chinuch says, what if they still get the Aveira, but there are other Arevs around them? There are other Dayanim. Meaning, why should they be committing a crime if this Malva and Lova could have gone to someone else? They should say, why do I get Lifnei there? After all, isn't it a case of Trei Avri Dinahara? Which is basically a case where that the Gemara in Avodah Zarah says that sometimes you're only lifnei iver if, for example, the nazir, right? If you sell wine to a nazir, so that's the classic case of assisting someone to commit a crime, to commit a sin. But what if there were 10 other stores and the nazir would have gotten the wine regardless of you? Why should I be chayav if there were other options? So that's the whole discussion over here that the Minchas Chinuch talks about. And he says that Elamayri dahaya malva blohem. The eno over alifnei ever, right? That the truth is that they may be chayav, the Arev and the Sofer and the Dayan and anybody in attendance, they'll be over the Lotase of Neshech, but they're not going to be over Lifnei Iver. At least they're spared from Lifnei Iver because the Malva and Lova had other options to go to. Okay, so I just wanted to bring that in because that's an interesting discussion that just when you thought that, maybe they're only chayiv on Neshech, they could be also chayiv on Lifnei Iver depending on the situation because of this uniqueness where we see it extending to other parties aside from the Malva and the Lova. So we saw the reason of the Minchas Chinuch, okay, which is pretty obvious. Let's look at the Ramban, because the Ramban in Kitetse is pretty much the rational opinion over here as to what's going on. Why, after all, should you be over a sin on something that's so that's a way to make money? And the Ramban actually tackles that problem, right? Because we all make money by charging interest. So the Ramban says, hey, it's not fair. So the Ramban says, I'm quoting from the Ramban in Kitetse. He says, Lo tashech lachicha zu mitzvahs muvueres, Yosef bekan ashara gam lolove, right? The reason why it is repeated in Kitetse, that it extends also to the love. Masha enken b'chol dinim amanos, which makes it unique aside from any other monetary issue. She'im ratzahu lazok b'nechasa brashai. What if a person says, you know what, I don't mind if your ox damages my ox, or something like that, right? So or steal from me. So if you say to someone, steal from me, so you don't get a sin for that. Only the stealer, only the robber gets the sin. So the Ramban says, why is it that the lova is included? So we don't want the lova to continue this. Okay, then he talks about why lending to why when it comes to a non-Jew, it's fine. The Ramban is tackling the existential question of why in the world is it a problem? After all, it's common way to make money. So why is it a problem? What's the reason? Right? After all, they both agree to it. Most sins are when one party either doesn't know or can't agree to it or doesn't agree to it. But if two people are willing and they each say, I want to do this, the Malva says, I want to make 10%. The Lova says, I am desperate. I need to be bailed out and I'm willing to pay 10% interest or 20% interest on a loan. I need help. How in the world could we impose a lav on the Lova? He says, because ela mitzad ha'achva v'hachesed, Moshe tziva v'haftu l'reacha kamocha. Because you have to go out of your way, because he's Jewish, as opposed to someone who's not Jewish, but because he's Jewish, you have an inyan, it falls onto the haftu l'reacha kamocha category. Moshe Amar, Hishamar lacha pen yed dvarecha im lecha, pen yed davar im levecha bliyal. Okay, so that's what the Ramban says. The Ramban says, because this is different than any other lav, okay, because you can't charge interest to your brother, to your Jewish, to a Jew. Okay, you have to do it for free. Now, we all know that this doesn't apply because of Heter Iska, and this beautiful, right, Ramban, unfortunately falls to the wayside because of all of our 100 ways around this, right? It's almost like Mechiras Chametz, right? Yeah, it would be great if we got rid of all our Chametz, but in a real world, right, this is one of those, we'll put in the category of real world, it just doesn't work. So we had to find a loophole, a legal halachic loophole, And just like we have a legal loophole around Mechiras Chametz, we have a legal loophole around charging interest. Maybe next week we'll talk about the heteriska, but at least for now, this is why the Ramban says before the heteriska, why you can't charge interest is because at the end of the day, it's the achva and the chesed, and it falls into the v'ahavta l'orecha kamocha category. And in fact, if you remember back on Daf Samach Aleph, right, to prove that this is such a unique, right, that this is such a unique mitzvah, the Gemara actually says, Amar Rava, I'm reading from 61a right in the middle, Amar Rava, lamali the kasav rachman alav beribis, lav begez, alav be'ona. The Gemara wants to know, at the end of the day, there's a common denominator between ribis, gezel, and ona, right? Ona is when you rip someone off, gezel is when you steal from them, ribis, you're taking money. So you're all these three categories, you're somehow taking advantage of someone else's money, right? So the Gemara said the chiddush by ribis is mishum the chiddushu, right? If I only had the lav by ribis, I couldn't extend that to lo tigzal or to onaa. Why? Dafilu belova asra rachmana. And this is what's a little bit what the chinuch hinted to before, was that because we even extend this to the love. And that's a really big chiddush. The Gemara even uses the word chiddush. Now, the Gemara in four or five other places uses this word chiddush, right? If you remember, use it by an eid zomem, we use it by basar b'chalav, right? There are certain examples where the Gemara uses the word chiddush, but here the word chiddush is trying to tell you that even the love is swept up into this, right? So therefore, right? So I mean, and Rashi explains, granted the malve is guilty, but the love agreed to it. So that's why it's called a chiddush, right? So that all goes back to the Ramban. It goes back to the Sefer HaChinuch about how it's so unique that even if you agree to get robbed, so to speak, then you're not pulling the wool over someone's eyes, right? You're telling him in advance, hey, I'm lending you money and I'm going to charge you 10%, right? So why in the world would the love, right, get punished? The answer is that's why, because it's a chiddush. Okay. I saw another reason in Parshas Bahar, right? We always like to quote from the Kli Yakar. So the Kli Yakar over here says on the pasuk of Al Tikach Meito Neshech V'Tarbis, he says Ki Iker Tam Iser HaRibis, right? The Kli Yakar's version of what the problem of ribis is more of a hashkafic problem than a Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, right? Havta l'reacha kamocha is bein adam l'chaveiro. So that's the Ramban and the Chinuch, talk about. But the Kli Yakar goes high. He doesn't go low. He goes up to bein adam l'makom. What's the hashkafic problem with ribis? Kitam iser haribis hu lefishu meisir midas habitachon min ha'adam. Because what you're doing is you're removing the midah of bitachon. Ki kol bal masa umatan, of every businessman, einav nesuas el Hashem. We all believe, and we say it all the time, right? The Gemara in Beitza talks about all of our profit for the year is decided, and you could think that you're in control, and you think that you know when to buy to buy low and to sell high, and you think that at the end of the day you're the smartest person in the room. At the end of the day, though, it's God that decides, and God makes you buy when a stock is at a certain amount and sell when it's a certain amount, and it's not because of your brilliant intuition. So that's what we believe bitachon is all about. You still have to do your hishtadlus, right, to educate yourself and to know about business matters. But at the end of the day, as the Kli Yakar says, "Umat einav nesuas el Hashem lefishahu mesupak im yarviach." He doesn't really know if this is the best time to sell, but he has bitachon, olo. Avo hanosin beribis, the problem that is created when you sign a contract, beribis, you at that point, I'm guaranteed 18% on this loan. And what happens when you put your guarantee in someone else? You're removing it from God's guarantee. Aval hanosin beribis, revach shelo yadua v'katsuv. It's carved in stone. You're already on the way to the bank with it, right? You bank on it. The katsu, the somach al ervono shabiyado. You're relying on this guarantee that this person just signed that he's going to pay 18% annual interest to you. Umin Hashem yasir libo. And you take all of that bitachon, you remove it from Hashem, and you put it into someone else's hands. That explains from the side of the malveh. But how do you explain from the side of the lova that the borrower is also committing a crime? Because at the end of the day, he says it takes two to tango. Without the lova, the malva has no one to lend money to with interest. So that's why the lova gets caught up in the storm also. Okay. And he goes on to say, Kenoda midavar hamalvin beribis sharuba makatli amuna. He says, in his generation, those who lend with ribis are people who don't have amuna, right? Va'avire lev harachokim mitzdaka. They don't give tzedakah, and the Kliyaka goes on to, as he always does, to say how, if you look at the common denominator between, these people, they have no bitachon. So that is the hashkafic way that the Kliyaka explains the problem with ribis. I thought that was a classic Kliyaka. Okay, so I wanted to shift, now that we have a little introduction as to the sources of ribis and what are some of the reasons, I wanted to talk about perhaps the most famous Gemara, at least in Bava Metzia, that appears on Daf Samach Beis. So the Gemara on Samach Aleph makes a statement about ribis ketzutza, which is basically, there's a discussion, there's a machlokas amoraim between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan. Let's say you did take ribis from someone, and it falls into the category of ribis ketzutza, which is a set, undebatable amount that you took. You lent someone $10,000, you charged him 10%, you got $1,000 at the end of the year interest. So at the end of the year, the question is, can you take that person to court? Or do we take that person to court? Okay, it's actually machlokas about how we take it out of him, how we take it out of the malveh, but Rabbi Elazar says, absolutely. That $1,000 that you got in interest is enforceable, that you could take it out of the malveh's hands. But when it comes to avak ribis, which is a lesser form of ribis that we spoke about, which is only the Rabbanan, a different form, that's not yotze b'dayan. Rabbi Yochanan says, even ribis ketzutza, that $1,000 you can't take out. Okay, and the Gemara on the bottom of Samach Aleph goes back and forth as to the difference between the Svaras HaMachlokes, how they learn from Psukim, and the Gemara makes a statement that Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak my time with Rabbi Elazar. What's the reason of Rabbi Elazar, who says, Amar Kra v'chei achicha imach, right? The pasuk in Bahar that is linked to Neshech, right, says v'chei achicha imach. Okay, it says don't take ribis. Why can't you take ribis? Because you want your brother to live with you. Meaning, make sure that he lives at least. And when you take ribis from him, you're going to kill him eventually. Okay, the Gemara on top of Samach Beis Amud Aleph says, Ahadale, give him back the ribis, ki heicha denichu. Right? Give him back ribis, so at least he could live to see another day with you. But Rav Yochanan says, no, v'chai achicha imach is for a completely different drasha. And here's where the fun starts. So what does Rav Yochanan do with Chai? For the famous brisa on the third line that says, "L'kedetanya shnayim shahayu mahalchin baderech ubiyad echad mehem kiton shalmayim." Two people in the desert. For all those who did this daf, or who didn't see this yet, this was the daf, okay, for Monday, I believe, which was the last days of Pesach, in case you didn't do it online. So you're doing it now. So you have two people, one canteen left. Okay, one person owns the canteen. Im shosin shnehen mesim, right? If they share it 50-50, they both won't survive. Im shosa echad mehen magil liyishuv. One person drinks it, he'll survive, and the other person won't. So we have a dilemma over here. Okay, we have a real life dilemma or riddle, or however you want to pose it. So Darish ben Petura. So there's two opinions what to do. It says ben Petura mutov sheyishtu shnehen veyamusu. Rather, both of them share it, but it won't be enough for either of them, so they'll both die. Okay, what does that accomplish? It accomplishes that nobody will be held liable for killing the second person because they each die. Rabbi Akiva darshans this pasuk that Rabbi Elazar learned for the purpose of returning the ribis in court to the lova, right? We're learning it for you come before your friend. So if in fact you are the owner of this water, you get to drink all of it, you live, and the other person dies because it's not his water. Okay? So what I want to do is, there's so much to talk about on this, a half hour won't do it justice. I wanted to just give a few highlights because this is a very, very important, hashkafic, practical on so many levels, how to deal with this situation. People take this Gemara and fast forward to the 21st century and deal with all kinds of moral dilemmas about shooting down airplanes, about I know there's a trolley, scenario about redirecting, various weapons to kill some people. Are we allowed to decide who dies and who lives? So this, as you can see, has tremendous amount of halachic ramifications. So what I want to do is, I want to discuss these two opinions. Okay, I want to discuss the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, understand where he comes from, and I want to discuss the opinion of Ben Petura, who I think is a one-hit wonder or maybe a two-hit wonder. We don't see him a lot, but Ben Petura was made famous. Sometimes, people, when they debate someone greater than them, they become famous as being the other opinion. Like we have that other famous Gemara that's quoted, I think, 4 times in Shas, about Nehemiah Hamasuni, and also Rabbi Akiva, about as Hashem el Kachatira. So Nehemiah Hamasuni became famous because of Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva has a habit of making people famous. Sometimes we have all these trivia questions about who else was involved. So here we have another case. So let's discuss the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. In order to discuss the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, you have to first present the obvious stira, because Rabbi Akiva says, on the one hand, your life comes before the other life, but on the other hand, and the Ramban asks this question, the Ramban says, I don't understand. Don't we know v'ahavta l'orecha kamocha? Right? So which one is it? V'ahavta l'orecha kamocha says you have to love your neighbor like yourself. Except if you happen to be in the desert with only one bottle of water left, then you don't love your neighbor like yourself. Then you take it all for yourself. So this is apparently a major, major, major contradiction. So in order to understand the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, okay, you have to read the Ramban. Okay, so the Ramban is in Parshas Kedoshin, and I think we saw this Ramban a number of months ago. I don't remember how we got to it, but because this is like a top 10 Ramban, I figured we'd spend a minute or two and just read it again. He says, Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, very famous word, haflaga. Haflaga in Hebrew means to overstate, to exaggerate a little bit. He says, when you're looking at Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, don't take it literally. Wow. Why not? He says, Ki lo yikabel leiv ha'adam she'ehav es chaver kavaso es nafsho. He says, forget about it. By nature, people are never going to love their neighbor like they love themselves. So don't even waste your time trying. Right? This is funny. This reminds you of the Ibn Ezra on Los Achmod a little bit, right? Where Ibn Ezra says, how could we be commanded to not to be jealous when, all we do is see other things from other people. So the Ramban sounds like he's going down that road, but not exactly. He says, and the proof why you can't take Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha literally is because of this Gemara. So the Ramban is asking himself this question. So the way the Ramban explains it is Ela mitzvah satorah sheyahab chaveru b'chol inyan kasher yahav es nafsho b'chol tov. Good. Kind of love your neighbor like yourself, right? Shelo amar ve'havta es reacha kamocha. It doesn't say ve'havta es reacha kamocha. V'hishva osam b'milas lireach. Why? The ger sheyeh b'veru shel hashos ava shneim b'daitu kipamim shehav adam esre'ehu b'dvarim yudum lehetiv ba'osher. Because the reality is that you should somewhat love your neighbor. For example, you may want him to be rich like you. That would be a great thing. But v'lo b'chachma. But maybe you don't want him to be as smart as you. Ukiyotza bazeh similar. V'im yiheh ohaval b'chol yachbot sheyizkeh re'ehu ha'ov lo b'oshev v'nechasim b'kav v'dasu b'chachma v'lo shvish alav. Meaning, you want him to be almost on par with you, but not exactly. He says, but at the end of the day, we all know that you want to be just a little bit above your neighbor, but that doesn't mean you should wish ill on him. So that's why the Ramban, and he goes through a whole lengthy discussion over here, he basically says that you should love him, absolutely, but you're always going to want a little bit more for yourself than for your neighbor, right? So that's the way the Ramban gets around this stira in Rabbi Akiva, okay? What's interesting is, Hafta l'recha kamocha, if you remember Masechet Shabbos, is the way Hillel answered the person who wanted to be taught Torah on Regel Achas. Remember what Hillel said? And over there, the Maharsha says, why is it in the negative? If Hillel wanted to teach the person Torah, he should have said, Hafta l'recha kamocha. Why in the negative? So the way the Maharsha explains is that when it comes to wanting bad upon your friend, that's when you say V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Meaning, don't do something detrimental to your friend, what you wouldn't do to yourself. But regarding doing something positive, then your life comes before the others. That's why you get to keep all the water. So that's the way the Maharsha in the Maseches Shabbos tries to explain this apparent contradiction about Chayecha Kodman against Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. The third way of understanding it is from the Chassam Sofer, a very, very controversial Chassam Sofer. The reason why I say it's controversial is because what the Chassam Sofer says, I'm going to read it inside is that Chayecha Kodman hainu be'inyane olam hazeh. When you say that, when you get to keep all the water, yeah, your life comes before someone else's life. That when it comes to olam hazeh. Aval b'chai hanitzchi dahainu b'limud Torah chayiv lumud lacher nafilu hu mevatel atzmo milimudo. You know what v'haftal recha kamocha means? That's when it comes to ruchnius things. That's when it comes to learning. Meaning you have a person that could spend all day in kollel learning by himself, or he could spend the whole time teaching other people. Now, it's much more difficult to teach because you have to spend hours. This isn't any commercial for myself, but you have to prepare many, many hours, and then you have to figure out how to teach, and it's not easy, and you have to relate to the students, and it's a big pain. Wouldn't it be easier to learn by yourself all day? So that's what the Chassam Sofer says, that that v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is the kamocha by teaching other people. I didn't see it inside, but I heard that Rav Moshe Feinstein, in one of his tshuvas, says that this Chassam Sofer is 100% wrong and does not agree with him. He says, absolutely, yeah, you may want to teach a little bit here and there, but you don't have to give your personal time to teach other people. So I don't want to get into a debate, but I just want to let you know that you rarely see Rav Moshe rail against the Chassam Sofer. Here you see one instance. I just figured it would be worth mentioning. What's interesting is, before we get to Ben Petura, how come, if you look in our Gemara, you'll notice that there's no Ein Mishpat, meaning the Rambam doesn't say, we haven't said the word Rambam yet. Usually you'd figure if we had this, hashkafic, debate, like this is like a really major debate, you'd figure that the Rambam would pipe in. But the Rambam is very silent. And anytime the Rambam is silent, everybody always comments, right? Whenever the Rambam says something, people comment. Sometimes it's what the Rambam doesn't say that raises the eyebrows of the Rishonim and Achronim. So a lot of Achronim understand that the reason why the Rambam doesn't opine, the Binyan Tzion actually says that, first of all, the Rambam holds that the halacha is like Rabbi Elazar, right? Remember how we got this whole discussion? Because we're talking about Ribis Ketzutza. So if Ribis Ketzutza gets paid back, so how do you know that it gets paid back to the Loveh? Because V'chei achicha imach. So therefore, we need the pasuk of V'chei achicha to tell you that we hold like Rabbi Elazar. So therefore, we can't learn from V'chei achicha that your life comes before the other person's life, like Rabbi Akiva. So that's why some Achronim learn that the Rambam doesn't hold like Rabbi Akiva, right? But we can't hold like Ben Petura, because we know that any time when Rabbi Akiva has a machlokas, we hold like Rabbi Akiva. So therefore, we can't hold like Ben Petura. So therefore, the Rambam sits this one out. I thought that was a very interesting. But if you actually look in the Rush, in the back of the Gemara, the Rush actually paskins like Rabbi Akiva. This is not just an agadata of two people in the desert. This, like we said, has major halachic, moral, all kinds of life-altering, consequential, decisions over here. So the Rush actually does hold like Rabbi Akiva. So in terms of knowing what to do, you got to take that water. Okay? So we discussed Rabbi Akiva at length. The question is, how do you deal with Ben Petura? So in order to explain why Ben Petura says what he says, you have to ask yourself, okay, so let's analyze Ben Petura for a second. He says, because a person, right, the owner of the water, he can't be Makayim b'chai achicha imach, right? Meaning it's his water. He'd love to help his friend, but helping his friend means death to himself. So he's in a bind. So he can't be Makayim b'chai achicha. So what does he do? He basically commits suicide, right? But how does that help? Meaning, why should I give myself half and the other half no one wins? Again, the net, according to Rabbi Akiva, is the net, one life gets saved. the net in Ben Petura's world is 0 life gets saved. Isn't 1 better than 0? And this is obviously the question that everybody should be asking themselves. So the Chazon Ish, in his explanation in Shulchan Aruch, I'm sorry, not, right. So the way the Chazon Ish explains is you have to understand that we have a concept, and if you remember, we had this at the end of Maseches Yuma, we had a Maseches Shabbos. We have a rule, and it comes into end of life and pulling the plug and all kinds of halachic questions about Chaye Shah versus Chaye Olam. We believe that Chaye Shah is just as important as Chaye Olam, meaning, believe it or not, you're actually allowed to, well, we know for sure that you could break Shabbos to take someone to a hospital who may die. What if you know for sure that a person's going to die, but by you breaking Shabbos, you let him live an extra 10 minutes? So the chiddush is that you're actually allowed to break Shabbos if you let someone live for 10 minutes, because Judaism believes in the preservation of life. Unfortunately, you see it in the news all the time. And usually whenever this is spoken about, it's, traumatic situations, very depressing situations. But we believe in life so much that we could break the cardinal sin of Shabbos just by keeping someone alive for 1 extra minute. Okay? So there's something called Chaye Shah. So what Ben Petur is basically telling you is you have to give up your Chaye Olam. You have to give up your life to share the Chaye Shah between 2 people. Okay, I'm going to read it inside. Shagam Ben Petur mo de she'ein adam tzarach limtzo nafsho lahatzal chavero imena osa maisa lahargo. Meaning, how am I killing him? I'm killing him passively. V'chayev kodmin l'chaye chavero. Yes, I come first. However, the problem over here is shakivan she'imiten achatzi maim l'chavero yuchu shneim chaye shah. What am I doing? I am extending my life by a half hour by drinking water, and your life by a half hour. Me accomplishing those 2 things is better than me living ad mea v'esrem. Again, it's hard to believe, or it's hard to convince someone, and he brings a proof, right? That Gemara and Yuma says that we, if there's an avalanche and on Shabbos, and you're going to break Shabbos, and you're going to save someone for even 10 minutes, then that takes precedent. Im ken, the words are ein chaye olam shalo, doche chaye sha'a shel chavero. I cannot be doche, me living ad mea ve'esrim, at the expense of someone else not even living a chaye shah, not even living a half hour on this, 3 gallons of water. Okay, Rabbi Akiva, that's why you have to split the water 50-50. Rabbi Akiva says, no, my chaye olam comes before my friend's chaye shah. Okay, so that is the way the Chazon Ish explains it. Now, on this, I saw an interesting Pischei Tshuva. The Pischei Tshuva has an interesting suffix. What if im yesh biyad echad ma'im she'afi mishta hakol lo yaspik lo ad she'yagi lo yishuv? What happens if I have water? Okay. What if I drink the whole thing, right? I still won't make it. But if I give it to my friend, he'll make it. Meaning, he drank an hour ago. Now he has no water left. I drank 12 hours ago. So it's my water, though. So if I drink it, I'm not going to make it. Okay? But if I give it to my friend, he'll have enough because he's in a stronger state than I am. Okay? So there's actually a suffix. What would Ben Petura say about that? Okay, so that's one interesting variation. The next variation on this, again, and because this is phrased as almost like, not a paradox, but almost like these riddles right, or these scenarios. The third one is something even more interesting, is what if there's a third party? Okay, the Chazon Ish brings another case. What if says the Chazon Ish, what if Ruvain has water? Okay, Shimon and Levi are dying of thirst. Okay, now what happens if I give the water to both of them? They're not going to live. Okay, so if I give it to one of them, they're going to live. So here, I'm almost like playing God over here. So in Ben Petura's world, would he still say to Ruvain to give the water to both of them and have both of them die, or give the water to one of them and one of them should live? Okay, so again, that's another discussion that the Chazon Ish also brings up on this, right? He's just adding a third party over here. So that's also a very tricky situation. But again, we saw all of this in the eyes of the Chazon Ish. How about the Minchas Chinuch? The Minchas Chinuch says, forget about Chaye Olam, Chaye Shah. The way the Minchas Chinuch explains it in Mitzvah 296. All right, if you know what Mitzvah 296 is, that's the very, very important mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. A very, very, very long Sefer HaChinuch that talks about Kiddush Hashem. And in it, he discusses that we have to give up our lives, and we've spoken about this many times, when it comes to three things: Gilu Arayos, Shvichas Damim, and Avodah Zarah, right? V'chai bahem, we live, right? If someone's dying, you break Shabbos. If someone needs to eat non-kosher, you give him non-kosher. Pikuach Nefesh trumps all, except when it comes to Avodah Zarah, Gilu Arayos, and Shvichas Damim. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Gemara in Ksuvas, we saw not too long ago, gives you the reason why is it that I have to give up my life if someone tells me to kill someone, right? Famous Gemara, my chazit, right? Why do you think that your blood is any redder? So if someone points a gun at me and says, hey, kill that person over there, or else I'm going to kill you, we have to lay our life down and take a bullet. Okay, that's the rule when it comes to Shvichas Damim. The question is that the Minchas Chinuch brings up, and through this he explains the logic of Ben Petura, is that a person has to give up his life so that the other person lives. Again, the gun is pointed at me, so I have to take the bullet. But what if the gun isn't pointed at me? What if I have an opportunity to give someone else somewhat of a life at the expense of my own life? That is what we call a sheve al taseh. So he says over here, Sheshvared ben Petura she'adam mechuyev limtzar nashvo b'shvil sheich chavero af she'ein chavero mes biglalo klal. Me and him aren't connected. This isn't the case of Gemara and Sanhedrin, of someone pointing a gun at my head. Elakiven sheyachol lahatzil es chavero. I have a commandment to save my friend. Mechuyev lasot ken af sheyimos al yedei kach. Even if I'm going to die, I have to do my best to save someone. So what are you going to ask? What's the obvious question? The obvious question is, if I have to save my friend at my expense, then why am I only giving him half of the bottle? Shouldn't I give him the whole bottle of water? Ready for this? The reason why I don't give him all the water, if I give my friend that water, then we have a circular discussion over here. We have a circular problem. He then has to give it back to me. Why? Because he has to save my life. Mishum she'imiten kol hamayim lechaveru, azay chaveru gam ken mechuyev litan lo mayim shelo yamus. V'kiven sheken hadinhu shekol echad yishteh. V'kiven sheken hadinhu shekol echad yishteh hachatzi v'yamusu shneihen. So what's the compromise? Compromise is that we split it in half. And when we split it in half, we both die. Now, very, very difficult to understand this, but that's really what's going on over here. It has to do with what we call sheve al taseh. It's one thing if I kill someone else like this actively. The question is, what if I am shev ve'al taseh? Okay, I just sit back and let someone else die. Does that fall into the category of giving up my life? According to Ben Petura, the answer is yes. Being passive is tantamount to being active. Okay, so that's really the reason why at least the Minchas Chinuch, and he goes on, and obviously we just literally hit the tip of the iceberg over here, because there's many different scenarios. There's Chronim, there's Rishonim that give more opinions over here. I didn't want to bombard. I just wanted to give everyone just a sliver, just so they could understand where these two people are coming from. So on that note,
Shkoyach.
I wanted to end over there.